So every so often, as a creator on YouTube, I have moments where viewers, yes, somebody just like you out there in the audience watching this video, actually send me content that they want me to react to. And when I receive this content, I look at the title, and I make a prejudgment based solely on the title. I judge the book solely by its cover, and I tell the person who sent it to me, you know what? I'll check this out, but rarely do I ever even look at it. I just reassure the person who sent it to me, thank them, and move on with my life and start watching episodes of Community. But every once in a while, when Netflix gives me the notification that says, are you still watching this? Because it's been hours and we're really worried about your health binging this show that came out in 2009, I go back and I look at those notifications and then I start playing the video and occasionally, and I mean very occasionally, 0.1% of the time, I watch the video all the way through, and I realized that this person that I had dismissed, politely, but still dismissed, has sent me something that is gold. It's amazing, it's elegant, and it's unbelievably cringe, and I definitely will have to make a reaction video to it. And that's what happened when I received this video from Knowing Better about the police. Now, full disclosure, I'm not going to go after every single claim in this video. I'm not going to overly nitpick the nitpickable parts about this video, because honestly, not everything in this video is something that I disagree with, and I don't want to give you guys the perception that I'm just targeting another lefty on YouTube just because they're a lefty on YouTube. You can have disagreements on policy or disagreements on certain things, but still respect the content creator that made the video. And overall, I think this content creator, from the videos that I've seen in the past, is a bit of a mixed bag. Some of his work is very good, and some of his work is sincerely lacking. But again, that's just my opinion, and it's based on my analysis, which is 100% right, as we've gone over a million times on this channel. Now, I also will not be disputing claims that I do in fact disagree with, but I'm saving for my analysis of the Netflix documentary 13th, the Ava DuVernay film that a bunch of people online consider a full-fledged education in criminal justice, despite its many discrepancies. So while I do have objections to those points of the video, I'm not going to be addressing them here because I plan to include all those objections in another video, and as much as I like repeating myself, which I do often on this channel, I want to save that for later because that really belongs at its origin point, not somebody repeating the same talking points from that movie in a video when that's not really the sole focus of that video. What I am mainly going to be addressing throughout the course of this video is the last third of the Knowing Better video, because this is where he starts making wild assertions about crime statistics that are in no way, shape, or form rooted in reality, and are often the same common mistakes made by left-wing actors when talking about crime. But first, I have this t-shirt. It's at my Teespring store. Use promo code DUMBPROMO for 10% off this t-shirt or any other thing in that store. I'm on BitChute, Minds, Patreon, Subscribestar. I'm on Parler, Twitch, now new Twitch channel, and on my second channel. All these different things that I'm on. Just go over, links in the description, follow, subscribe, and all those things. I'm trying to get this out of the way. Now, probably one of the most downright silly talking points that have ever come out due to this recent uptick in anti-police activism is this idea that police shows are propaganda because they show police officers being more effective than they actually are. Now, normally, I would set this position aside as ridiculous because it is in fact ridiculous. However, it appears in the Knowing Better video, and it's just absurd to see somebody in a serious video where they're talking about the police bring up this non-point.
This is an example of propaganda, which has wildly distorted police effectiveness in the public consciousness.
Really? Propaganda? That's the term that you're gonna go with? As if people actually believe that Angel, after becoming human, joined the FBI and then partnered with a forensic anthropologist who was capable of solving a murder a week based solely on looking at the bones of a suspect, all while having a will-they-won't-they relationship that eventually, like almost all will-they-won't-they relationships, eventually turned into a will-they, which then diminished a sole aspect of the show because people get more invested in the will-they-won't-they aspect rather than them actually being a couple. It actually feels quite underwhelming when you do this trick for multiple seasons, because in the audience's mind, the expectation of the relationship is far more superior than what will actually be depicted on screen once these characters finally realize that they're in love with each other. You know, somewhere in that rant, I may have lost the actual point I was trying to make, but let's see if I could dial it back a bit and get back to the point I was trying to make. The reason that police departments or specific units that work with the police or the FBI on television shows appear to be more effective than they actually are is not due to any propagandistic purpose, it's due to story structure. You have a crime, typically a murder, that acts as your inciting incident. You have an investigation which progresses the plot, and then you have your last minute plot twist where it's not the person you think is the killer or the person that all the evidence points to as being the killer, it's actually this other person, and then they confess, and that gives you a resolution. It has nothing to do with actually depicting a realistic police department and everything to do with story structure. And one of the ways that you know this is actually true, other than the fact that your IQ is above room temperature, is because the same exact format works even outside police procedurals. House MD, which was a popular show on the Fox network, is actually a police procedural disguised as a medical drama. Every single week, a different patient comes in with an issue, which is our inciting incident. The patient's condition and the progression of the testing and the attempt to diagnose the patient also correlates with one or all of our main characters' B-plot, and by the end of the case, House ends up figuring out what's wrong with the patient by determining what's the thing that the patient lied about during the course of this medical investigation. This is a police procedural, again, disguised as a medical drama, because the formula for a police procedural is entertaining. It fits within a compact television structure. That's why they do it. It's not propaganda for cops or propaganda for doctors, even though it does show them being more effective than they actually are. Because I have news for you, and this may be shocking to people out there in the Knowing Better audience, but television shows are not documentaries. Television shows are not surveillance video at actual hospitals or police precincts. They follow a dramatic structure. It's not meant to be anything else but entertainment. And the idea that this is an issue, that police shows aren't less entertaining and that writers writing police shows want them to be more entertaining, is patently absurd and ridiculous, and is probably the biggest non-point to come out of this movement since it started.
Throughout the war, they adjusted the importance of and punishment for different drugs, usually based on race.
Now, the next thing I want to touch upon with the Knowing Better video is this point that he tries to make about the disparity between crack cocaine sentencing and powdered cocaine sentencing, which is a standard regressive left talking point when it comes to criminal justice debates. The argument goes as follows.
There is no pharmacological difference between powder cocaine and crack. They have the same effect on your body. The only difference is how it gets into your body, and which racial groups prefer which method of ingestion. If they're basically the same drug, you would expect that getting caught with a gram of powdered cocaine would result in the same punishment as a gram of crack, and you would be wrong. If you were caught with 5 grams of crack, you would get a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years in prison. You would need 500 grams of powder cocaine to get the same sentence. White people tended to use powder cocaine, while black people tended to use crack.
You get the point? Crack cocaine, more likely to use by black people. The sentencing is 100 times harsher than powder cocaine, which is more likely to be used by white people, even though fundamentally they are in fact the same exact drug. Powder cocaine and crack cocaine are both cocaine. One just includes water and baking soda. So there's not that much of a difference, therefore there should be no disparity. Therefore, if there is a disparity, the disparity is solely due to one drug being preferred by black people as opposed to the other drug being preferred by white people. Sounds reasonable, sounds logical, and a lot of people tend to use this talking point. However, it is outright revisionist history, because while crack cocaine and powder cocaine are fundamentally the same drug, there are some important distinctions between the two that can explain why black legislators were the ones pushing for harsher sentences when it came to crack cocaine. And I think the best way to explain this is with a bit of an analogy. And I know as soon as I start this analogy, the gun people are going to start writing in the comments about how ignorant I am, but try to follow along. It's not meant to be a perfect, accurate analogy. It's just meant to illustrate a point. Rifles and pistols are both guns. they both fire bullets, and those bullets can kill people if they are struck by those bullets. However, historically, gun control advocates tend to be more restrictive on pistols than rifles. And I know you're thinking about the assault weapons ban and all that nonsense. Just set that aside for a second. Most states that have gun control regulations typically limit the purchasability of pistols to age 21 while having the purchasability of rifles at around age 18. And this is despite the fact that rifles with their longer barrels are typically easier to aim and potentially, by statistics, might have more deadly power behind them. And this is because pistols are typically cheaper, they're concealable, and pistols are the cause or the gun of choice in 90% of all shootings in the United States of America. In fact, it's significantly higher. Of the 10,000 people that are murdered by guns in the United States of America, something like 250 of them are murdered by rifles. This is why the disparity in a lot of places for possession of a handgun, due to its concealability, due to the fact that it's cheaper and more available, due to the fact that the gun is more likely to be used in a crime than a rifle, is higher than that of a rifle. This is why the regulations around pistols are a lot of times much stricter than the regulations around rifles. Likewise, crack, which is fundamentally the same drug as powder cocaine, is significantly cheaper than powder cocaine, and thus would contribute more to an epidemic than powder cocaine. Also, crack sentences are intrinsically tied to the violence of crack offenders. If you compare what will get you a mandatory minimum or what will reduce your chances of getting a mandatory minimum, there are typically three things. One, if whether or not your arrest was violent. Two, whether or not you would have a gun on you at the time of your arrest. And three, whether or not you would lie to the cops. Now, you would think, because they're both drugs and they're both illegal, that these things would probably be similar. But it turns out that of crack cocaine cases that were arrested, only 15% of defendants arrested on crack cocaine charges met these three criteria to avoid a mandatory minimum sentence, compared to over half of the people arrested for cocaine possession. So crack is tied to violence significantly more than cocaine is tied to violence, and again, it's already cheaper and more accessible than its powdered counterpart. Also, claiming the disparity between crack cocaine sentencing and powder cocaine sentencing is solely due to the typical race of a user of either of those drugs only works if you only isolate crack cocaine and powder cocaine. If you look at the methamphetamine sentences, they're actually quite in line with the crack cocaine sentences. But there's a problem if you're trying to push a racial narrative when it comes to methamphetamine, because only 2% of the people arrested for methamphetamine are black. The majority of people arrested for meth possession are white, and despite the fact that one is a white drug and one is typically thought of as a black drug, the sentencing, again, is nearly identical. This is because sentencing regulations around certain drugs, when they're deemed to be an epidemic, are based on very little base knowledge at the time that these policies are implemented. It's also based on the fact that we have a bias against smoking something in a pipe. It looks worse, so to our mind, this is why these drugs tend to have a more strict sentence. It's also due to the price of these drugs. Because they're more available, they can more easily become widespread, and when you're with the criminal justice system and you have the hammer of incarceration as a deterrent, everything looks like a nail. The only way that this argument actually works is through historical revisionism. You have to pretend that the people who advocated for these harsh sentences weren't in fact the people who advocated for these harsh sentences, and you have to pretend that we have the same knowledge base or the same publicly available knowledge base now looking back on the epidemic that we did back then. That's not the case. The reality is, this was thought of to be a major epidemic, and in a lot of places it was a major epidemic, and the response, while draconian and something that I disagree with, was not based on racism whatsoever. Now, if I'm being perfectly honest, the crack cocaine thing is a common mistake, and honestly, I don't want to ding this person too much for making that, because that talking point is out there, and it's almost become a religious tenet of people who are against the drug war. And as somebody who acknowledges the actual facts around crack cocaine sentencing and how it's not based on race, I still would like to eliminate the disparity, because I think overall the drug war is ridiculous and we're way too harsh on drug offenders. For me, addiction is an illness, it's not a crime. So I understand that somebody whose heart is in the right place might get that wrong. But then we move on to where we start getting into crime measurement and policing tactics, and the information in this is so misleading, so inaccurate, and so embarrassingly wrong, I just have to go into it.
Proactive policing. Instead of waiting to react to a crime after the fact, they go out and try and stop it before it happens. Yes, just like Minority Report, but since they don't have any of the futuristic technology, cops just have to use their gut instinct and maybe past crime statistics. So which neighborhoods did they target for proactive policing? White people commit crimes at pretty much the same rate as black people, but racial profiling practices like stop and frisk had cops specifically looking at minority communities. And if you're looking for a crime, you will find one. For various historical reasons, minorities tend to be poor, so they don't have the ability to mount a successful legal defense, leading to higher conviction rates. But minority communities are disproportionately more likely to be proactively policed, which results in more convictions, which results in more proactive policing, which this cycle has been pretty much unbroken since the Civil War.
So everything about this little segment is wrong, and I understand when somebody delivers something with a level of confidence and certainty, it can be hard to detect when somebody's just being misleading, but in reality, you can tell that it's wrong because throughout that little segment, he started by saying that arrests determine patrols and police presence, and then all of a sudden by the end of it, he was saying convictions determine patrols and police presence. Both of those are wrong. First of all, arrests are not the same thing as convictions. And secondly, neither of those determine police presence. Now, earlier in this segment, he started talking about stop and frisk, so I'm going to use the NYPD because that's the most notable organization that practice stop and frisk, but this concept can be applied more generally when we're talking about proactive policing. Now, the first thing that you need to understand is that crime is neither measured in arrests nor convictions. Crime is actually measured in reports. And you know this intuitively without me spelling it out for you, but I'm going to do this anyway. Think about if you're driving a car and then somebody comes up to you and they carjack you and you make a report to the police that you were just carjacked. But they never arrest the guy who did the carjacking, and because they never arrested him, they never convicted him. Does that mean that that carjacking did not happen? Of course not, because obviously you were carjacked, you lost your car, that was reported. That's what we measure crime in, reports, not arrests, not convictions. Now you'll notice an asterisk on the screen as I'm saying this, because there's also another way that we measure crime that I'm going to get into a little bit later, but that's not really important right now. I'm just putting that asterisk there and I will address it later. Don't worry about it. Now, departments like the NYPD use a system called CompStat in order to determine where police should end up patrolling. And CompStat may sound a little bit complicated, but it really isn't. All it is the police mapping reports geographically and sending patrols to high crime areas. These areas are not patrolled due to the racial or ethnic makeup of the population. This is solely based on the history of crime reports in those areas. And the reason they use reports and not arrests or convictions is because that's not how we measure crime, and also, it's way easier to respond to a surge in reports than it is to a surge in arrests or a surge in convictions that could happen years later down the line. Now, the reason that Black and Hispanic New Yorkers were stopped disproportionately to their population in New York City under the Stop and Frisk program was not due to their race or ethnic origin. It was due to the fact that the NYPD was targeting areas based on the higher number of reports, and specifically based on the higher number of shootings. And if you look at any given year during the course of the Stop and Frisk program, you will see that shooting suspects were 94 to 97% chance likely to be Black or Hispanic during the period of the Stop, Question, and Frisk program. And during that time, the peak percentage of Black and Hispanic people stopped during this program was 84%. So if you actually break down the numbers and you compare them to the crime that they're trying to deter with the program, Black and Hispanic New Yorkers were actually under-targeted by the program by the percentages. Now, we've gone over in the past the actual failings of the Stop and Frisk program and where it got out of hand under Michael Bloomberg, and I don't want to delve too much into that, but essentially what happened was Bloomberg started increasing the number of stops because he thought the program was effective, and he ignored the diminishing returns and the violations of people's Fourth Amendment right when he increased the stops so dramatically. But it wasn't racially targeted, and that's the point that I'm trying to make. It was a Fourth Amendment violation.
Did crime actually rise, or did our definition of a crime expand?
Now this is where we get into peak insanity when it comes to the Knowing Better video, because now he's moved on from misrepresenting police programs to completely denying the giant crime wave from the 70s that ended up peaking in the early 1990s.
Why did the crime rate spike in the 90s and then drop as the prison population grew? Well, I hope by now that you can see that the crime rate never actually grew. We just expanded our definition of what constitutes a crime and what constitutes a jailable offense. We've talked a lot about the drug war in this video, but this holds true for all crime.
The assertion that there was no such crime wave over this period of time only works if you completely hollow out your brain and you take your information directly from this portion of the video and ignore all other data and all other information to the contrary. Yes, of course, we did make more things illegal during this portion of time, but the best way to determine whether or not there was a crime wave before and after this time is to measure crimes that were already illegal before and after this time that you're saying that there is or isn't a crime wave. For instance, this is the homicide rate over the same exact period of time. You can see the chart is nearly identical. We didn't get more homicides because we just made murder extra illegal during this period of time, and anybody who argues this to the contrary is ridiculous. You can also subtract homicides and look at just violent crimes, and you'll see the same exact thing. Assault was illegal. Most of these violent crimes, if not all of them, were already illegal prior to this time period where we supposedly just added a bunch of new laws. This is one of the most absurd, misleading, and outright ridiculous talking points when it comes to crime I've ever encountered on this platform. It is in no way based in reality, and I would call it a far left delusion, which is what I would normally do on this channel, but I've actually never heard somebody on the far left make this argument. That's how ridiculous it is. And if you think that maybe the reason that we're getting higher crime rates, just ignore the homicides because whatever, that's really inconvenient and there's no refuting or disputing that, but the violent crimes is because we have higher police presence, then maybe you should look at this asterisk from earlier in the video. Because you know how I said crime was measured in reports? Well, that's not the case, because there are in fact limits of reports, and a lot of lefties tend to point out that there are limitations to reports because a lot of crimes don't get measured because they don't get reported. Now, they point this out like it's a checkmate maneuver, but in reality, we've known this since 1976 when we instituted the National Crime Victimization Survey. And the National Crime Victimization Survey seeks to fill in the gaps of uniform crime reports by going directly to people and asking them about their past history of being victimized by crimes. And this survey goes out to a ton of people every year. 176,000 households are measured by this survey, and this is how we get statistics on whether or not crimes are reported or not. This survey is the gold standard in terms of measuring crime for everything except homicide, because obviously homicide victims cannot fill out surveys. And what we find with the National Crime Victimization data, which by the way, if you look at Bureau of Justice statistics, this is often at the bottom as one of the sources of crime data, is that there was in fact a crime wave during this period of time.
White people commit crimes at pretty much the same rate as black people.
We also find that crime is in fact disproportionate depending on your racial group, because people who take this survey, when they can identify the perpetrator against them, show that the racial disparities we see in terms of violent crime in the United States of America are in no way, shape, or form due to police activity. Now, I will link all of this data that I mentioned throughout the course of this video down in the description box of this video, and I'll actually label it, unlike Knowing Better, who doesn't, so I basically have to click every single link, and they're not even in order to figure out what he's exactly citing, so you can go over this yourself, but you need to know the basics of how you measure crime before you make wild and inaccurate assertions just like this guy. You need to know that if you're going to compare things that weren't illegal to things that are illegal, of course you're going to get a disparity from the period that they were illegal to the period that they weren't illegal, and that's why as a control you would compare things that were illegal during both periods of time.
The overall crime rate in the United States peaked in 1991. At the same time, the incarceration rate grew exponentially, then leveled off. The easy explanation is causal, that by putting so many people behind bars, they weren't free to commit crimes. The only way you could think that the relationship is causal is if you think it's the same set of criminals repeatedly committing all of the crimes, and we caught all of them. There are no new criminals.
Wait, what?
The only way you could think that the relationship is causal is if you think it's the same set of criminals repeatedly committing all of the crimes, and we caught all of them. There are no new criminals.
What?
Repeatedly committing all of the crimes, and we caught all of them. There are no new criminals.
What? Obviously, we don't think that they caught all the criminals with mass incarceration and there are no new criminals. The crime rate reduced, but it didn't go to zero. This is an absurd non-point, and it's completely ridiculous. And I forgot to record my reaction to it, but it needed to be stated that this is absurd. Like, yes, we locked up a lot of criminals, but not all of them. We don't have a zero crime rate. Now, I am very rarely stunned by the ridiculousness of statements on the internet, and especially on this platform. If you have a ridiculous and dumb opinion, I probably heard somebody advocate for it passionately in a video despite its inaccuracy. However, in the context of this guy's other videos, which are usually better put together, this is pretty stunning. This is pretty shocking, and it's pretty embarrassing. But those are just my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Obviously, if you like this video, then show me by leaving a like. You can subscribe for more content. You could support me via the various support links in the description box of this video. You can follow me on other social media accounts and all that jazz. But yeah, that's really all I got for you. Till next time.